When her master, Wang Qingchen, cast Go Iching into the medicinal pool to be refined into a living medicine, her eyes had already been given to him willingly. When he gouged out her eyes, he asked if it hurt. She said it didn't. When he annulled their engagement, he asked if she was bitter. She said she wasn't. Now, when her usefulness was exhausted, she was discarded like an old broom, thrown into this extremely toxic, boiling hot medicinal pool. Still, she said she had no regrets. Amid the rising steam, the young woman, who had just turned 20, tilted her head upward. Her eyes were wrapped in white bandages, and she gazed lovingly at her master, softly murmuring, "Master, would you grant me one last request?" Wang Qingchen stood with his hands behind his back, expressionless. He looked down at the figure in the pool, the figure that had followed him for 10 years. After a long pause, he coldly replied, "Speak. If the refining fails and I die here, could you personally bury me? I only ask for a small mound of earth, so that I won't become a wandering ghost without a home after death." Her light, nearly pleading voice echoed in the misty air, frail and humble. "And, Master, now that your eyes have been restored, you no longer need the blind cane. Could you bury the greenwood cane I made for you alongside me, so it can accompany me in the grave?" Wang Qingchen's eyes, black and bottomless, reflected no emotion. After a long silence, his lips finally moved. "Very well. If you meet an untimely end, I will personally see to your burial. The greenwood cane will be laid to rest with you. You may go in peace." His voice was cold, devoid of any emotion. Yet in the medicinal pool, Go Iching seemed relieved. She slowly nodded, her face blank, as if talking to herself. "That's good, that's good. With the greenwood cane, I won't be all alone on my journey. I won't trip and fall because I can't see the way." Her low murmurs drifted like delicate threads in the wind, reaching Wang Qingchen's ears just as he had already turned to leave. It was as if an invisible hand had stopped him in his tracks, making him pause abruptly. It felt like a long time ago, there was a small voice in his ear, filled with infinite concern and tenderness. "Master, let me guide you. Hold your blind cane firmly, take one step at a time, and you won't trip just because you can't see the way." Amid the swirling white mist, Wang Qingchen's breathing quickened, his hand pressed against his aching forehead as something sharp and unavoidable tore through the air, closing in on him relentlessly. Xianin Peak had emerged as a rising power in the martial world in recent years, with its ranks divided into 3 major sects and 18 smaller ones. Its hierarchical system was strict, its following vast, and its techniques mysterious. The orthodox sects of the martial world saw it as a heretical cult and stayed far away. That year, chaos erupted within Qianin Peak, and a great upheaval took place within the Qing sect. Go Iching, who was not yet 13, escaped along with her senior brothers and sisters. At 10 years old, she had ascended Qianin Peak, joining the Qing sect and becoming a disciple of its leader, Wang Qingchen. She was the youngest among her peers, her large, dark eyes always timidly observing others. At that time, the chaos was fueled by the Zixing sect and the Hushan sect joining forces to launch a surprise attack on the Qing sect while the old leader was in seclusion. Their aim was to kill Wang Qingchen. Wang Qingchen was gravely injured, and during the ambush, his eyes were poisoned, leaving him completely blind. In the midst of the chaos, apart from a few of Wang Qingchen's senior disciples and loyal followers who were determined to protect him, most of the followers fled like scattered birds, seeking to save their own lives. "We're all running. What about the master?" Go Iching was swept along by the fleeing crowd and timidly grabbed the sleeve of a senior brother to ask, "What master? He's nothing but a demon in disguise. Has he ever taught us even half a technique? If you don't escape while they're fighting amongst themselves, when will you?" Her senior brother was too busy running to waste time. He shook her off and disappeared with a gust of wind. Go Iching stumbled but gritted her teeth, a surge of emotion rising in her chest. Clutching her small medical kit tightly, she turned and ran back. She was an orphan, having drifted through the chaos of war. At 10 years old, she had been picked by a ghost scout of the sect and taken to Qianin Peak along with a group of other chosen seeds. Her frail body was unsuitable for martial arts, but the keen-eyed scout noticed her long, delicate fingers, which made her an ideal candidate to learn the Qing sect's unique silver needle technique. Thus, she was assigned to the Qing sect and began studying the art of silver needle acupuncture. The ghost nanny who taught her had intended for her to use it to kill, but Gu Yiqing's timid nature meant she couldn't even harm a small rabbit. Over time, she veered toward the medical path instead, using her skills to heal. However, Qianin Peak was a place of intense competition, where the goal was not to save lives but to take them. Having never accomplished any tasks for the sect, Gu Yiqing remained the lowest, most despised level, while many of her peers had already risen to second or even third-class disciples. Yet, she didn't mind. Her nature was peaceful and content. As long as she had clothes to wear, food to eat, and a roof over her head, she was satisfied. She could also pursue her passion for medicine. What more could she want? And besides, the Qing sect had her master, the figure she could never get enough of watching from afar. At 10, she climbed the mountain. For the next 3 years, she lived quietly, the most insignificant disciple of the Qing sect. She had seen her master up close no more than 7 times. The most recent time was when she was 11. After a year in the sect, while training in the back mountain, the ghost nanny who oversaw her caught some wild rabbits and ordered her to kill them using the silver needles. Gu Yiqing clutched 3 gleaming needles, her hands trembling as tears welled up in her eyes. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't bring herself to do it. The ghost nanny, frustrated with her lack of progress, eventually snapped and whipped her. The lashes left Gu Yiqing crying out in pain, her small face pale as snow, pitiful and miserable. It was at that moment that a figure appeared. Grabbing the whip, the person flung it aside with a flick of the wrist, their voice cold as ice. I wondered who was making all this noise, disturbing my meditation. It turns out it's you, Aunt Qiu, disciplining your disciple. But if you keep beating her like this, you'll only end up killing yet another Qing sect disciple. Aunt Qiu's face paled as she realized she had accidentally intruded on Wang Qingchen's meditation area. She immediately knelt in fear, repeatedly apologizing. If she can't bring herself to do it, don't force her. Qianin Peak doesn't need to torment children like this. With a soft sigh, the figure in the green robe bent down, wiping the tears from Gu Yiqing's face. For the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled a rare, faint smile. Crying like this, you look just like I did when I was your age, like a little crying cat. His voice was low and slightly hoarse, but unexpectedly soothing. It was a side of her master she had never seen before, so gentle, it felt like a dream. And that night, she indeed dreamed a dream she didn't want to wake up from. In the dream, her master, dressed in his green robe, held her hand as they stood in the back mountain, watching the wind sweep through the clouds, with the trees and grass lush all around them. The air carried a light floral fragrance, refreshing and peaceful, unlike the constant killing, intent, and bloodshed that pervaded Qing sect throughout the year. Though her master never paid attention to her again, she suddenly had a little secret, a small joy hidden in her heart, one she couldn't tell anyone. For the next 700 days at Qing sect, every day she would hide behind a corridor and steal a glance at her master's flowing green robe. It became her greatest happiness. A happiness so great, she didn't want to leave Qing sect. She didn't want to leave him. At first, Gu Yiqing and her blind master, Wang Qingchen, lived through a period of utter hardship. That day, during the chaos, Gu Yiqing snuck back into the Grand Hall. The place had just witnessed a brutal massacre, with most of the first-class disciples of the Qing sect killed. Only Wang Qingchen, covered in blood, was still holding on, his formidable martial arts deterring anyone from approaching him. The surviving enemies hesitated, unsure whether to press forward, retreating just outside the hall. It was at this moment that Go Iching, hidden in the shadows, rushed out with her medical kit. She fumbled to prepare medicine to stop her master's bleeding, but before she could apply it, a blood-soaked hand shot toward her, grabbing her neck. "Moss Master, it's me, Iching Go Iching. I joined the Qing sect in the 7th year of Yuan Feng, the youngest disciple in that group." Her breath was choked off, and she stammered incoherently in fear. The man with the bloody hands paused upon hearing her words. His eyes, blinded by poison, were tightly shut, and blood streamed down his face in horrifying streaks as he tilted his head, seemingly trying to make sense of her presence. In a trembling voice, she added, "2 years ago, you saved me on the back mountain. I was learning the Silver Needle technique, but couldn't bring myself to kill anything. You told the ghost nanny, Qianin Peak doesn't need to torment children." The figure in the green robe hesitated for a moment. Slowly, the hand clutching her throat loosened its grip. "It's you?" Wang Qingchen frowned, his wide sleeves sweeping through the air. "Why did you come back? Why didn't you flee? Are you here to die?" Having narrowly escaped, Go Iching fell to the ground, coughing violently, her face as pale as paper. Because Master is still here. Iching couldn't leave you behind." Aware of Wang Qingchen's unparalleled martial prowess, the 2 sect leaders of the Zixing and Hashan sects, along with their disciples, hesitated outside the hall, unwilling to confront him directly. But then, a cruel idea took shape in their minds. Rather than facing Wang Qingchen head-on, they would set the hall ablaze, burning everything to ashes. As oil was poured and the acrid scent filled the air, flames roared to life, rising like a monstrous dragon with a gaping maw, ready to devour everything in its path. "To think you can destroy me? Utter nonsense. Who lives and who dies is yet to be determined." Inside the hall, Wang Qingchen, blood staining his green robes, smiled ruthlessly as Go Iching supported him. He whispered in her ear, "Quick, help me to the rear hall. There's a secret passage from my chambers that leads straight down the mountain." With a thunderous crash, the hall collapsed. From that day on, Go Iching accompanied her master, who had lost his martial prowess and sight. They lived in seclusion, healing his wounds and hiding their identities, and for 2 years, they relied on each other to survive. Those 2 years were anything but easy. Amid the chaos of the times, they struggled to make a living. Even though Go Iching possessed medical skills, she often couldn't work due to taking care of her master. The meager earnings she managed were barely enough to provide 3 meals a day for the 2 of them. And on top of that, they constantly lived in fear of being hunted down by people from Qianin Peak, always on edge, never knowing when danger might arrive. Yet, in Go Iching's heart, those 2 years of living in close quarters, relying on each other day in and day out, were the happiest years of her life. For the first time, she could be close to her master, no longer just stealing glances from afar as she had during the 700 days and nights in Qing sect. No longer was he the distant figure in flowing robes she could only admire from the shadows. Though their life was simple, with coarse food and plain clothes, they lived in a humble bamboo grove, with the heavens as their roof and the earth as their floor. With the wind, the moon, and her master by her side, what more could she possibly want? In her heart, Go Iching secretly wished they could live this way forever. But Wang Qingchen's bouts of madness reminded her all too often of the truth. Her master was born with unmatched talent, with an unyielding spirit. He was never meant for this life of obscurity, standing as a mere mortal. He belonged atop the world, looking down on it, his robes untouched by the dust of the mundane. He couldn't let go of the past, nor could he forget. The fall of the Qing sect had one root cause: treachery. Wang Qingchen had calculated everything, but what he hadn't foreseen was that the person who betrayed him and the Qing sect was none other than his fiancée, the holy maiden Qilan. They had grown up together at Qianin Peak, and out of all the disciples, the old master favored them the most. He not only passed down his unique techniques to them, but also personally arranged their marriage. They were childhood sweethearts, sharing an innocent love. Wang Qingchen thought he understood this bond well. He had even gone so far as to train in the brutal art of assassination for her, forcing himself to abandon his peaceful nature, to do what he hated, and to stain his hands with blood, walking a path from which there was no return. But it wasn't until Qi Lan blinded him with poison and disabled the mechanisms that allowed the Zixing and Hessian sects to infiltrate the hall that he realized how wrong he had been about this so-called love. In this world, the most terrifying thing is not ghosts or gods. It is the human heart. He had trusted her with everything, but she had easily betrayed him for power. In the moment she blinded him, pressing her poisoned hands over his stinging eyes, he only heard her cold, venomous words in his ear. "Don't blame me. It's you who refuses to fight. If one doesn't fend for themselves, the heavens will strike them down." Yes, he hadn't wanted to fight. After years of endless battles, he was tired, weary of it all. He had told her that once they married, he would take her away and they would live a peaceful life far from the bloodshed. But she didn't want that. She refused and looked down on him for it. Back then, Qi Lan's gentle demeanor had changed. She had repeatedly urged him to fight for the position of sect leader, saying the old master loved him the most and would surely pass the title to him. All he had to do was take a little initiative, and victory would be his. Her persistence wore on him, and eventually, he refused to see her. Over time, Qi Lan stopped coming altogether. He hadn't thought much of it, never realizing that while he was focused on his training, his fiancée had already switched sides, calculating her future and seeking out a new backer. What she wanted, he couldn't give. So she went to find another man. She had even told him that she cared for him, but not enough to sacrifice her own interests. Every night after that, Wang Qingchen would be tortured by those words, as if they were needles piercing his very bones. His bouts of madness were all because of her. Every time it happened, he would be overwhelmed by rage and agony, and it was only his little disciple, Go Yiqing, who would bravely hold him and use the silver needle technique to calm his chaotic blood flow. He grew sensitive, paranoid, and utterly resentful of his poisoned, blinded eyes, feeling ashamed of the permanent loss and what it represented, something he could never get back. In those countless, endless nights of despair, it was always the small figure of Go Yiqing by his side, holding him tightly and whispering words of comfort into his ear. He would shout at her, push her away, and lash out in anger, telling her there was no bond between master and disciple. He told her that if she was tired of him and didn't want to be dragged down by him, she should leave and never come back. "Master, don't be like this. Yiqing will never betray you, never leave you, not ever." No matter how much he yelled at her or how cruelly he tried to drive her away, she never considered leaving. She stayed with him, shedding every tear she had, choking back sobs, shaking her head over and over, promising that she wouldn't leave, that she wouldn't abandon him. She was a kind-hearted, soft girl, so gentle she bordered on self-effacing. She knew all of his wounds, and she guarded them, protecting him through the darkest and most painful days, refusing to leave him alone. And he knew what was in her heart. He had even heard her murmur in her sleep, saying she wanted to stay by his side forever, living a simple life without concern for the outside world. He had chuckled at her innocence, tucking her in more securely, before turning his gaze blankly toward the void, his eyes open but as empty as ashes. Once, he had wanted to live a quiet life in the wilderness with the woman he loved, but that woman had cast him aside, pushing him into the abyss. Now, there was a girl who cared for him, who wanted to live a peaceful life by his side, hidden from the world, but he couldn't let go of his past. He couldn't turn back anymore. One great disaster, one deadly betrayal, had left him completely changed. All that filled his heart now was hatred. His only desire was to heal, regain his strength, and return in full force to reclaim what was rightfully his. He had once refused to fight, but now, no one could stop him from taking back everything that was his. 2 years after the fire that destroyed the Qing sect, Qianyin Peak was preparing for a pivotal martial competition. The old master, after waiting in vain for 2 years, finally succumbed to grief, accepting the account given by the leaders of the Zixing and Hushan sects, as well as the holy maiden, Qilan. They claimed that his beloved disciple, Wang Qingchen, had perished in the fire, with no body left to bury. Disheartened and indifferent to who would take over, the old master declared that the result would be decided through a martial contest. The leaders of the Zixing and Hushan sects would openly battle before all, and the victor would inherit his position, becoming the new master of Qianyin Peak. The winner would also marry the holy maiden, Qilan. On a clear, cloudless day, the two sect leaders engaged in a deadly fight, using their life's worth of skills. They battled fiercely, showing no regard for the brotherly ties they once shared. Just as the Zixing sect leader struck a blow that sent the Hushan sect leader vomiting blood and collapsing to the ground, victory seemingly within his grasp, two unexpected guests arrived at Qianyin Peak. If you're fighting for the throne, the capable shall reign. How can the Qing sect be absent from this contest of the three great sects? A figure clad in green robes, carrying a greenwood cane, slowly approached, supported by a veiled young girl. Though his eyes were blind, his aura remained untouched. He was still the same peerless Wang Qingchen of old. Wang Qingchen. The Zixing sect leader's face turned pale, and even the wounded Hushan sect leader on the ground struggled to raise his head. The holy maiden Qilan, who had been standing by the old master's side, went even whiter, unable to believe her eyes. Of all those present, none was more overjoyed than the old master, who had always loved Wang Qingchen dearly. He was so overwhelmed that he didn't even have a chance to speak before Wang Qingchen knelt before him, his voice clear, though tears welled in his eyes. "Forgive your disciple for coming too late. I shall settle the scores and resolve the past before reporting to you, Master, what truly transpired that day." With those words, Wang Qingchen's green robe fluttered as he leapt onto the stage, the Zixing sect leader breaking into a cold sweat. Clenching his fists in frustration, the Zixing leader growled, "Victory is determined by the strongest. You're no longer the Wang Qingchen of old. I refuse to believe a blind man has any power left." Before he even finished speaking, purple and green robes collided in a flash as the two figures clashed, their battle beginning instantly. Below the stage, Go Yiqing, veiled and holding tightly to her master's greenwood cane, stared intently at the fight through the curtain, her heart pounding like a drum. The Zixing sect leader's martial skills had advanced tremendously over the past 2 years, making him an equal match for Wang Qingchen. Moreover, Wang Qingchen still carried old injuries and was blind. As the fight wore on, Wang Qingchen began to lose ground. "I thought you'd be more impressive today, but it seems you're just as weak as ever?" The Zixing sect leader sneered, his eyes flashing with killing intent. Moving like the wind, he launched his ultimate technique, surrounding Wang Qingchen with a whirlwind of phantoms. His movements were so fast that they created countless afterimages, making it nearly impossible for any ordinary martial artist to discern which one was real. And with Wang Qingchen blind, how could he possibly keep up? The Zixing leader's confidence soared as he saw Wang Qingchen growing dizzy within the whirlwind, even his sharp hearing failing to pinpoint the real enemy. A glint of excitement flashed in the leader's eyes as he found the perfect opening. With lightning speed, he raised his hand like a blade and lunged at Wang Qingchen's heart, aiming for a fatal blow. "Watch out!" The old master, unable to contain himself any longer, cried out in alarm. Go Yiqing clutched the greenwood cane tightly, biting her lip as her breath caught in her throat. Blood splattered everywhere. A palm strike pierced through flesh, and a scream tore through the sky. But the one who screamed wasn't Wang Qingchen. It was the Zixing sect leader, his pupils contracting in disbelief, his eyes wide with shock. "And no, impossible, you." Wang Qingchen slowly withdrew his bloodied hand, then pulled a handkerchief from his sleeve and began to wipe it clean with deliberate calm. His brows arched slightly, his eyes no longer blind. He scanned the crowd, his gaze eventually settling on the small figure of Go Iching. His expression softened instantly, his words slow, clear, and echoing throughout the arena. "Who told you I was still blind?" Go Iching gently removed her veil, her eyes wrapped in white bandages. She smiled at Wang Qingchen, her expression serene, as if they shared a silent understanding, a gentle beauty like spring water rippling in the breeze. When Go Iching gouged out her own eyes to give them to her master, Wang Qingchen, he asked her if it hurt. She shook her head and smiled, though her smile was pale. "It doesn't hurt," she said. "I am willing to do anything for you, master." Wang Qingchen's sensitive and suspicious heart finally melted under her faint smile, softening like a flower bud just beginning to bloom. He held her close, as if his desolate soul had finally been revived, and choked out, "Iching, once I've settled all scores and regained everything, I will marry you. We will rule Qianin Peak together, and I will take care of you for the rest of your life. I will never let you down." In the face of his heartfelt promise, Go Iching rested in her master's embrace, lightly nodding and smiling gently, her expression as serene as the mountains and rivers. "Okay." Her eyes were covered in white bandages, and her voice was soft. "As long as it makes you happy, master." In the 12th year of Yuan Feng, Go Iching was 15 years old. After 2 years of wandering outside, she returned to Qianin Peak with Wang Qingchen and helped him reclaim everything. Wang Qingchen, with his iron will and ruthless methods, lived up to his fearsome reputation as the jade-faced demon. The bodies of the 2 palace leaders, who had betrayed him, hung outside the hall doors as Qianin Peak underwent a complete restructuring. 1 year after Wang Qingchen took over, the situation was fully stabilized and his position was unshakable. The old master, relieved and reassured, passed away, leaving his legacy to his beloved disciple. Everything settled, all disputes resolved, except for one, Holy Maiden Qilin. On the day of Wang Qingchen's victory, Qilin had knelt at his feet, weeping and repenting for her actions. After all, they had grown up together as childhood sweethearts, and with the old master pleading on her behalf, Wang Qingchen's heart softened. He didn't sentence her to death, but instead imprisoned her in the dungeon for the rest of her life. Fearing that Go Iching might misunderstand, Wang Qingchen held her in his arms that night, resting his chin on her head as he carefully chose his words to explain. "I have no lingering feelings for that woman, it's just..." "Iching understands." "Master, you needn't worry," Go Iching gently interrupted him, her soft voice filled with warmth. She nestled against him like a little kitten, smiling with complete trust, leaving no room for doubt. Wang Qingchen sighed. She was always so obedient, so good that he felt unworthy of her. Touched and full of affection, he held her tighter. His black eyes gazed out the window toward the bright moon and stars as he made a silent vow. He promised that once everything was fully stable, he would marry Go Iching and make her the most beautiful bride in the world. Yet this stability took a full year. After the old master's death, Qilin sent word through her guards, asking Wang Qingchen if she could attend the old master's funeral. She claimed that, as someone the old master had treated like a daughter, she needed to pay her final respects. Along with this message, she sent Wang Qingchen a jade ring, inscribed with the words, "Till death do us part." It was the engagement token Wang Qingchen had personally crafted for her years ago. In their room, Go Iching noticed that Wang Qingchen had been silent for a long time. Softly, she spoke, pulling him from his thoughts. He coughed awkwardly, hiding his discomfort as he slipped the jade ring into his sleeve. He told the messenger, "Tell her that since we were once master and disciple, I will allow her to offer incense for the old master." That day, during a storm, Qilin was released from the dungeon, trembling as she entered the funeral hall. Draped in white mourning clothes, her long hair hanging loose, her pale face was streaked with tears, pitiful to behold. Wang Qingchen watched her offer incense with a complicated look, then turned and said coldly, "That's enough. You may leave." Qilan bowed her head and wept, offering more words of repentance before walking toward the exit. Her fragile figure appeared utterly desolate, but before she could take a few steps, a thunderclap startled her. She turned back, grabbing Wang Qingchen's sleeve and sobbed. "Qingchen, this will likely be the last time I see you. Once I return to the dungeon, I may never leave again. Will you share one final drink with me as a farewell?" Outside, the thunder and lightning illuminated the brief moment of hesitation on Wang Qingchen's brow. In the corridor, Go Yiqing leaned on her greenwood cane, carrying a medicine box and Wang Qingchen's cloak. She was slowly making her way to the funeral hall. The wind howled, and she knew that his old injuries acted up during rainy days like this, causing him great pain. Her heart filled with worry as she waited, but when he didn't return after a long time, she grabbed her medicine box and his cloak and set out to find him. The wind grew stronger, the rain heavier, darkening the sky and stirring a deep unease in her heart. When she arrived outside the hall, she realized, too late, what she had stumbled upon. If she had known, Go Yiqing would have preferred never to have left her room. Inside the hall, the unmistakable sounds of a man and woman in the throes of passion reached her ears, indecent and unbearable. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and Go Yiqing immediately covered her mouth in shock. Her medicine box fell from her shoulder, scattering across the ground. Trembling all over, she slid down against the wall, biting her lip hard. Silent tears streamed from her eyes as she sat outside, heartbroken. By the time Wang Qingchen, jolted to his senses, rushed out in a panic, all that remained outside the hall was a scattered medicine box and his familiar cloak. The dark clouds pressed down, the wind howled through the trees, and rain mingled with the cold air, sweeping through the desolate night, leaving only the bitter cold that pierced to the bone. Qilan was eventually released from the dungeon, restored to her status as the Holy Maiden, and stood as an equal to Go Yiqing, the future mistress of Qianin Peak, assisting Wang Qingchen. It was as if everything had changed overnight, too sudden and sharp for anyone to properly prepare. In the following years, Wang Qingchen was consumed with expanding his power. Many matters became out of reach for Go Yiqing, and her gentle and compassionate nature was ill-suited for the violence of the martial world. In contrast, Qilan, who had weathered many storms, stayed by Wang Qingchen's side, repeatedly proving her worth and helping him immensely. Gradually, Wang Qingchen saw less and less of Go Yiqing, and their relationship grew more distant. It became so indifferent that Go Yiqing felt as though everything had reverted to the way it was in the beginning, back to the time when she could only steal glimpses of him from afar, hiding in the corridors. But now, even a glance felt like an unattainable luxury. She could only rely on her ears, straining to hear each word he spoke to her. His words were few and precious, but she collected every one of them, treasuring them like drops of gold. Alone in the cold nights, she would replay them over and over, holding on, deceiving herself until her tears soaked her pillow. Go Yiqing didn't understand why their relationship had suddenly become like this. The night she witnessed him and Qilan in the hall, she hadn't slept. She had huddled in a corner, shivering like an abandoned kitten, arms wrapped tightly around herself. He knew she had seen, yet he only softly explained in the beginning, saying that he had been drunk, as if under a spell, unable to control himself, and had made a mistake in a moment of confusion. Of course, she didn't blame him. She nodded obediently. Even though the unease gnawed at her, she remained gentle and compliant. Later, Wang Qingchen released Qilan from the dungeon, saying that she had come up with a few brilliant strategies to atone for her past and help him expand his domain. Go Yiqing nodded again, saying nothing, but the unease inside her only grew stronger. As time went on, things became increasingly outrageous. At some point, without her even realizing when, everything had changed. Eventually, Wang Qingchen no longer even bothered to hide his affection for Qilan, openly displaying it before Go Yiqing, no longer offering any explanations or apologies. Go Yiqing, too, became more and more numb and silent. The sharp pain that had once cut like a knife gradually dulled into a void of nothingness. She fully accepted Qilan's presence. In her humble and naive heart, she convinced herself that Wang Qingchen simply needed an assistant. No matter what, she would always be his only wife in the end, the one who would stay by his side forever. And that was enough for her. But even this small hope was something Wang Qingchen was unwilling to grant her. After catching them together again, Go Yiqing turned to leave, but Wang Qingchen called her back. Rubbing his forehead in apparent exhaustion, he finally spoke. Yiqing, let's call off the engagement. You saved me, helped me, stayed with me through my darkest times, never leaving my side. You even gave me your eyes. I am deeply grateful, but this isn't love. In the autumn of the 15th year of Yuanfeng, Wang Qingchen and Go Yiqing's engagement was formally dissolved. The wedding, postponed for 3 years, would never take place. All their shared memories faded away, dissipating like smoke under Qilan's calculating smile. Go Yiqing fell gravely ill. During her illness, Wang Qingchen came to visit her. Holding her hand, he asked if she resented him. In her fevered state, tears slipped down her face, soaking the pillow. Yet she softly murmured, "As long as it makes you happy, master." In that moment, Wang Qingchen's heart clenched, as though struck by a heavy blow, leaving him breathless. But strangely enough, the pain was forgotten by the next morning. Though he felt guilty for what he had done, he could never bring himself to love her. That guilt faded with each passing day, until eventually, he became indifferent to her, viewing her as little more than a stranger. Like a fleeting wind, the years and emotions that had slipped through his fingers vanished completely, beyond his reach. That year, Go Yiqing was 18, an age as fleeting and fragile as a flower in bloom. Her life, once vibrant, withered overnight. The wild geese grow old, the flute falls silent, and old friends never return. The following spring, Wang Qingchen and Qilan were married. The wedding was grand and became a celebrated event in the martial world. On that day, Go Yiqing lay in her dim little room, half awake, hearing the sounds of fireworks outside. Struggling to get up, she accidentally fell off the bed, the pain causing her to gasp. She wanted to drink some water, but the teapot was long empty. This small, insignificant corner of Qianin Peak had long been forgotten by everyone. She slowly dragged herself to the door and managed to push it open. Just then, a firework exploded in the sky, dazzling and beautiful, like something out of a dream. But she could not see it. She could only tilt her head and listen, lying by the door with a silly smile on her face. The night wind was strong, and she soon began coughing, her hand covering her mouth. It felt sticky, and she caught the scent of blood. Over the past year, her health had worsened. At first, Wang Qingchen still visited her a few times, but as time passed, he grew too busy, and his visits became less frequent until he never stepped into her courtyard again. On countless cold and lonely nights, the only thing that kept Go Yiqing company was the greenwood cane she had once made for her master. She would stroke the cane over and over, feeling the warmth he had once left on it, clinging to those memories of their time together. She often thought back to the 2 years they had spent wandering the world, supporting each other, relying on one another. Sometimes, she doubted whether those 2 years had been real at all. Looking back, they felt too distant, like a fleeting dream. She couldn't hold on to it. She couldn't grasp it. When the dream ended, nothing remained. Wang Qingchen returned to the small courtyard 4 months after his marriage to Qilan. Not long after, Go Yiqing would be turning 20. The little girl who had first climbed Qianin Peak as a child had experienced the highs and lows of life, and in the blink of an eye, 10 years had passed. But Wang Qingchen's reason for visiting wasn't to celebrate her birthday. It was for something else entirely. Lan'er is pregnant, but the pregnancy is unstable. The famed Dr. Jiang said the only way to ensure the safety of both mother and child is to prepare a medicinal pool filled with the essence of 100 herbs and find someone with the right constitution to be sacrificed as a living medicine to absorb the essence for her. Wang Qingchen didn't finish the rest, but Go Yiqing's body stiffened. Her hand trembled as she poured tea, spilling the scalding water onto her hand, though she didn't seem to notice. All she felt was a chilling cold. As a healer, she had heard of the process of creating a living medicine. It was a brutal and cruel process that ordinary people could not survive, as it would devour them whole. Of all the people on Qianyin Peak, only she, a girl who had spent years studying medicine and tasting countless herbs, had the right constitution. She was the perfect candidate. If you're unwilling, I'll send someone else to find another candidate, though it may take some time, Wang Qingchen said as he noticed her lack of response and prepared to leave. But then, a soft voice stopped him. I'm willing. It was as if she had grown tired. There was nothing left for her in life. Sitting at the table, the fading sunset cast a golden glow over her, making her look ethereal. She smiled faintly, her pale face turned toward Wang Qingchen. If you search elsewhere, who knows how long it will take? Besides, I don't have much time left anyway. It's better to make use of what I have left for master and mistress. The words mistress came out awkwardly, but Go Yiqing smiled, just as she had years ago, and murmured, as long as master is happy, it's all that matters. At some point, she had reverted to calling herself your disciple before him, never daring to overstep her bounds. Perhaps she should never have hoped for anything more. If she had never hoped, she wouldn't have had to lose. Wang Qingchen was silent for a long time before he finally spoke in a hoarse voice. Very well. When everything was ready, Go Yiqing was thrown into the medicinal pool on the day of her 20th birthday. Standing in the pool, enduring the unbearable pain, she tilted her head up in the rising steam, her eyes wrapped in white bandages. In a soft voice, she called out to Wang Qingchen, who stood at the edge. Master, may I ask one last favor? Speak. If the process fails and I die here, will you personally bury me? All I ask is for a small grave so I won't become a wandering ghost, homeless and alone in death. She didn't ask for much, just a grave and for her greenwood cane to be buried with her. Very well. If anything happens to you, I will personally see to your burial. The greenwood cane will accompany you to the grave. Rest assured. Wang Qingchen turned and left, his footsteps gradually fading. Go Yiqing smiled faintly, her consciousness slipping away. It was as if her eyes could see once more. In the midst of the searing pain, she seemed to see green mountains and clear waters. She saw herself, years ago, standing with her master, Wang Qingchen, on the back mountain. He wore the same green robe as always, holding her hand, as they stood together, watching the long winds sweep through the floating clouds and the lush trees below. She had climbed Qianyin Peak at 10, been saved by her master on the back mountain at 11, supported him during their 2 years of wandering at 13, returned to Qianyin Peak at 15, had her engagement broken off at 18, and fallen gravely ill at 19. And now, at 20, after all those years, she had spent a full decade by his side. 10 years of her heart given to him, sharing countless spring and autumn days. She didn't feel pain, nor bitterness, nor regret. She had lived, loved, and given her all. This life had been long enough and fulfilling enough. Stumbling back to his chambers with a splitting headache, Wang Qingchen arrived just in time to catch Qilon slipping something into his usual wine cup. What are you doing? Startled, Qilon didn't expect him to return so soon. She tried to pull her hand back, but it was too late. Wang Qingchen seized her wrist, pulling out the half-dissolved paper charm. As he examined it closely, his face darkened. The remnants of the paper charm bore the name Go Yiqing and half of her birth date, details that sent shockwaves through Wang Qingchen's mind. His head pounded as memories flashed before him like bolts of lightning, shattering the fog of confusion that had clouded his mind for so long. Clenching the paper charm in his fist, he suddenly realized what had been happening all these years. All the clues and inconsistencies fell into place, and with a roar of fury, Wang Qingchen grabbed Qi Lan by the throat, overwhelmed by a crushing sense of regret. "So it was you vile woman. You controlled me with this forgetting charm." The spell Qi Lan had been using was a long-forbidden technique from Qianin Peak, thought to have been lost for years. During her year in the dungeon, Qi Lan had been searching for a way out. By sheer luck, she had found a loose floor tile and, beneath it, the long-hidden charm spells. More than just a charm, it was a form of poisonous sorcery. Those affected by it would gradually forget their old love and become emotionally bound to the one who cast the spell. It didn't erase memories entirely. He still remembered everything. But the emotions were dulled, blunted to the point where he could recall every detail but felt no love, no stirrings in his heart. The string of love was severed. That night in the hall, Qi Lan had cast the spell on him, driving him to madness and confusion. Over time, she had continued feeding him the poisoned paper charms in his wine, each one inscribed with Go Yiqing's name and birth date. As he drank it daily, his love for Go Yiqing faded, leaving only cold indifference. Years of charms and poison had left him unable to feel anything for her, even though he knew every moment of their shared past. Eventually, he had come to treat her like a stranger. But human emotions are stronger than any spell. The feelings buried deep within him had begun to stir, threatening to break free from the spell's grip. Qi Lan had noticed and grew increasingly fearful. True, burning love could never be fully suppressed by the cold chains of a spell. As long as Go Yiqing lived, Qi Lan felt threatened, unable to rest easy. Yet she didn't dare take any overt action against her, fearing that Wang Qingchen would find out. Living in constant anxiety, she hatched a plan, placing her hand on her stomach with a malicious smile. The unstable pregnancy, the need for a living medicine. It was all a lie, concocted with the help of a bribed doctor. What she wanted was simple: for Go Yiqing to disappear from this world, naturally and completely. But fate had a way of revealing the truth, and Qi Lan's true nature was exposed. After she was dragged away, Wang Qingchen, consumed by grief, raced toward the medicinal pool. He was running toward Go Yiqing, toward the girl he had failed for so many years. The wind howled fiercely, whipping his robes as tears blurred his vision. His long black hair flew in the storm as Wang Qingchen, his heart now fully awakened, cried out in anguish, his voice echoing across the vast expanse of Qianin Peak. Through his tear-filled eyes, he seemed to see the 11-year-old Go Yiqing again, trembling with a silver needle in her hand, too afraid to harm a rabbit. After being scolded by the ghost nanny, she had cried her heart out, looking just like a little flower cat, a mirror of his own childhood self. In all the days that followed, he had always known she was secretly watching him, but he never exposed her. He merely smiled to himself, feeling a quiet affection for her, treating her as the kind-hearted little girl she was. That same little girl had risked everything to help him escape, cared for him day and night without complaint, and held him tight during his fits of madness, promising she would never betray him or leave him. When he wanted to return to take his revenge and reclaim everything, she gouged out her eyes, giving them to him so he could deceive his enemies and triumph. He had delayed their wedding again and again for the sake of his ambitions, and when he finally broke off the engagement, she accepted it without a word of complaint. She had lain sick in bed, blind and alone in her desolate little courtyard. Even though he had neglected her completely, when he came to her with a proposal to become a living medicine, she had agreed without hesitation. All these years, no matter what he asked of her, no matter what he took from her, she always gave it willingly, without a single word of reproach. Her most frequent words had always been, "As long as Master is happy, it's all that matters." What a foolish girl. After 10 years together, her kindness and love had been like the stars in the sky or the clothes he wore, things he saw and touched every day but took for granted until he had grown blind to them. He was unworthy of her love. The wind carried his tears away as he thought of how she had been his Cain for 2 years. Now, he vowed, he would hold her hand and be her support for the rest of her life, never letting go again. I Ching, wait for me. Wait for Master to save you. His heart thundered.
He still had time.
He could make it in time. Yet, like the birds chirping in the trees, the story was already drawing to a close, the curtain falling on this final act. The performance was over, and the audience had dispersed. Some things, once lost, could never be reclaimed, like the wind slipping through fingers or the song of an old flute that would never play again. When spring came, the flowers would bloom once more, but old friends would never gather again.